Hey everybody, how you doing? Welcome to Howdy Partner. This is a show where we come and bring on partners from the APN and we highlight what they've been doing and how they can help with your AWS environment. So today we have JupiterOne. We'd like to welcome Erkong and Akash. How are you two doing?
Doing great. Glad to be on.
Yeah.
Awesome. And then here with me for the first time today is Chloe, who is a new co-host here on our show. Chloe, you mind saying hi?
Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. So again, for those who haven't seen our show before, we are highlighting AWS partners and the products that they bring to the table to help you improve your experience in the cloud. So real quick, let's go ahead and get an introduction from Erkong and Akash themselves. And then from there, Chloe's going to give us a beautiful introduction on AWS security.
That sounds great. I'll start. This is Erkong Zhang. I'm the founder and CEO of JupiterOne. I've been a security practitioner for pretty much my whole career, and I was a former CISO, head of software security at Fidelity and other companies. And I've built JupiterOne to solve a lot of my own and my team's challenges on a day-to-day basis. We'll certainly get into that a bit more. And there's a lot of great partnership here with AWS. JupiterOne is built on AWS, right? We use a lot of the services, and but also a lot of analysis that we're doing for AWS and other cloud-native related security infrastructure and security operations. So, Akash?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a solutions architect here at JupiterOne. I lead the solutions team. Really excited to be here and talk about cloud security in the context of AWS. I actually have been in the cloud space, in the machine learning space, security space for the past 7 years. Really excited to talk about it.
Awesome. Thank you two for joining. All right, now, so what we're going to go ahead and do is Chloe's going to give us an introduction of security in the cloud. Chloe, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen.
There we go. All right.
Hi. Can everyone see okay?
Yep, it's looking great.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chloe, and I'm a partner solutions architect at AWS. Today, I want to introduce JupiterOne by providing some context on security at AWS. I think that some knowledge around AWS security services will be helpful as you learn more about the JupiterOne offering that will help you govern your cyber assets. So I want to take some time to briefly introduce GuardDuty and Inspector. These two services will help you improve the security of your workloads, and they'll also be relevant with regard to JupiterOne. JupiterOne's product can ingest and correlate findings from these services, and you're going to learn more about that soon. So first, GuardDuty is a threat detection service. It continuously monitors for malicious activity so that you can protect your AWS accounts and workloads. And it does this in two methods. There's threat intelligence and machine learning. So how does it work? With just a few clicks, GuardDuty immediately begins analyzing billions of events from multiple AWS log sources that are stored on S3. These log sources can be of CloudTrail logs, either your CloudTrail management events or data events, VPC flow logs, or DNS logs. GuardDuty will collect threats using machine learning and anomaly detection, and then you can review detailed findings in the console. So they can be integrated into your workflow systems, or they can also trigger Lambda functions for automated remediation. So here are some of the key benefits that have really resonated with customers. First, there's continuous security monitoring and threat detection at scale. The service is also fully managed, so there are no agents, sensors, or network appliances for customers to deploy. There are no complex permissions to provision, no data sources to enable. So as a result, customers are up and running in minutes. There's also broad coverage. So GuardDuty goes beyond just protecting virtual machines and the network. It can monitor all AWS account and user behavior for unauthorized activity. And this has typically been a gap for most customers. And then lastly, there's no performance or availability impact. There's no footprint in your accounts, meaning that there's no risk of performance or availability impact to your workload, which is awesome. So here are some examples of threatening activity that GuardDuty can detect on S3. First, there are insights around bucket policies. So a bucket that's made public, logging on a bucket that's disabled, or let's say that the root credentials are being used to delete objects or list objects in a bucket. And that's problematic because it's recommended that you don't use your account's root credentials to access AWS services. So that's something that GuardDuty can detect and is really helpful for. GuardDuty also generates findings around malicious access. So let's say that there is an S3 API operation invoked from an IP address that's included on a threat list you uploaded. This clearly indicates unauthorized access to your S3 bucket, and you could get this information in order to remediate a compromised S3 bucket that may not have the proper permissions on it. There are also findings around anomalous user behavior. This could be an unusual location or an unusual bucket. So here's a screenshot that I actually took from the management console to see GuardDuty in action. As you can see, there are finding types in the middle that tell you the type of findings here. In this case, it's unauthorized access to EC2 instances. And then on the right, you can get more details around that finding. So it shows you that it's low severity. It occurred 4 times. You can see the time and also the region where it took place. I'll just pause here for you all to look for a little. And now I'm going to switch gears a little bit to talk about Amazon Inspector. Inspector helps you identify security vulnerabilities so that you can improve the security and compliance of your workloads on AWS. The Inspector assessments are offered to you as predefined rules mapped to common security best practices and vulnerability definitions. Examples of these rules are checking for access to your EC2 instances from the internet or vulnerable software versions installed. These rules are regularly updated by AWS security researchers, so they're up to date. So what security challenges does Inspector address? And these are typically around complexity problems, a lack of skills, and security costs. So with complexity, for example, with EC2, there's a lot of information about your EC2 instances that you need to keep track of. What operating systems installed, versions of software, and there's also a lot of skills that are needed to make sure that your EC2 instances are secure. You need to collect a lot of security rules, whether that's the CIS benchmark or the CVE rules packages. And then you also need to know what to check in your AWS environment, and that can require a lot of work and skills. Lastly, a lot of solutions have high upfront costs for licenses and contracts, and Inspector is great because it will take care of these issues for you. So how does Inspector work? It helps you discover potential security issues by using security rules to analyze your AWS resources. So Inspector monitors and collects behavioral data about your resources. The data includes information about the use of secure channels, network traffic among running processes, and details of communication with AWS services. Next, Inspector analyzes and compares the data against a set of security rule packages. And there are certain rule packages that you can select from, which include network reachability, common vulnerabilities, the CIS benchmark, and best practices. And what's great about Amazon Inspector is that you can use any combination of these rule packages. So you have the opportunity to get network assessments and host assessments. And then finally, Inspector produces a list of findings that will help you identify potential security issues of various levels of severity. So here's another photo that I took to show you Inspector in action. This is the dashboard that's in the management console. And you can see in the middle that there's a section for notable findings. There's the assessment status, which shows you the assessments you've completed. And then on the right, you can actually see that what the assessment is and when it was run. And then here's an example of one of the summaries. So if you actually want to click onto that summary, you can download it as a PDF. And you can also see the rule packages that were selected in this example and what the findings were and how severe the issues were here. Just give you all a second to look. So with that, thank you so much. We are a show that bring on our partners to showcase their offerings. So now I want to introduce JupiterOne.
There we go. Erkan, Kakash, blow us away.
That sounds great. So we get the real show started, right? So no, that was great. Hey, thank you for introducing Guard Duty and Inspector. We certainly leverage those in our products to help improve the security capabilities of any organization. But anyway, I want to take us a little bit of a step back, right? So to tell you a bit of a story of my own journey as a security practitioner and former CISO here, because one thing at JupiterOne that we say here, right? So let me start sharing a little bit of our company vision, right? So what I believe and what our whole company, our whole team believe is that security is a fundamental basic right. It is the wellness of an organization, and it has to be looked at that way, right? So, but what does that mean, right? So for me, when I look at security, there's really a couple ways to look at it. One is a lot of people look at it as a necessary evil, and it doesn't really impact your top line. It's not a revenue generator. It's a cost center, right? That's how usually most organizations look at security, right? And there's not a whole lot of investment that goes into it. It's just, hey, we have to make sure that we don't get breached, and cover our butt. That type of mindset, right? But so what resulted in that is a lot of organizations, when they come to security, they actually think compliance, right? And they go with this sort of check the box approach and think that is how they approach security. But that really shouldn't be the case, right? So we talked a lot in the industry that security doesn't equal compliance, and vice versa. So and that actually has been a challenge that I see as an industry that we have, right? So for 20 years or so of my professional career in this space, there are a couple of things that really bothered me. Right, so I'll tell you what those are. So the two things. One is that we have lots of good solutions out there, right? So security products, solutions, hundreds of them, probably thousands of them. There are new startups and vendors coming up with great stuff every year. But why isn't that working? We were still seeing this many breaches and all of these problems that we have. Why isn't that working? Right. And second is, I've been a auditor and consultant in my past life as well, and I've been on the other side of the fences. I've been a former CISO. I've been a former auditor. This is a hard job, right? So we have folks. You guys have a hard job here. I understand. I've been in your shoes. So why is it that we say that security doesn't equal compliance and vice versa? Shouldn't it be that compliance is meant to help people be more secure and reduce risk and so on and so forth? So where's the disconnect? What's the problem? So those are the two things, right? Those are the two things I'm set out to explore and resolve. So thoughts so far? What do you think, Braeden and Chloe and Nakash?
Yeah, absolutely. I really like the thought that security isn't necessarily compliance and vice versa, right? There's quite a bit of overlap, obviously, but the idea of actually separating those and making those the two separate entities that they actually are really makes it. And us at Amazon, at AWS, we love to be customer obsessed, right? And I believe that by making security and compliance its own separate thing and not doing security things just for the sake of compliance is definitely customer obsessed.
Yeah, but then how do we, even though they're separate concepts, and how do we, bridge the gap between the two, right? So to make it more meaningful, to make security more meaningful in the eyes of compliance and vice versa, right? To make compliance actually reduce risk from an operational standpoint. So let me get back to those two things, right? So those two things I mentioned. One is, what's wrong, what's missing, and why are we still kind of so broken in all of these security stuff? And to me, it really boils down to something very fundamental, right? So we, for the longest time, the industry talks about, hey, this great stuff, this great tool, this next gen product, whatever that is, this machine learning AI driven approach to this great features, but beyond all of those buzzwords, what is really broken to me is the fact that organizations, we don't understand ourselves very well. We have a lack of visibility, but not just a lack of visibility, but a lack of understanding of what's going on in such a complex and frequently changing environment that we have today. Right, because today everything's software defined, things are in the cloud, in AWS or other clouds, and then you have SaaS products, and you have developers and engineers writing code to define things and change things, and CI/CDs and all of those things, right? So that's all great. It drives business forward. It makes things happen faster, but at the same time, it also significantly increases the complexity of an organization and the digital operation of that team. So the lack of understanding of how all of those connect together is what I think is fundamentally missing. Right. So
I have a quick question, actually. So you mentioned that there's a disconnect between what security is, and it comes from understanding your organization. And I there are a lot of good intentions out there with a lot of organizations that believe they have a decent understanding. I guess, what are your thoughts on that? For does there need to be a redefinition of what security is, or what it means to what a specific threat looks like or is modeled?
That's a great question. I think it boils down to fundamentally what I mean by understanding your organization, and what I mean by an asset in your organization, right? So this problem, it's not necessarily new, right? So people have been trying at solutions at this problem, which is CMDBs basically, right? And they say, hey, if you have a configuration management database, which collects information about your assets, or you have asset management, right, and asset inventory for your resources, then you can have a good starting point of understanding your organization and what goes on in your infrastructure and your digital operations and so on and so forth, right? But the traditional approach to CMDB and to asset management isn't working, and it really boils down to, first of all, the question you ask, right? So how do we redefine at a fundamental level what's needed for an organization to understand themselves? So, and to me, an asset historically, right? So when we talk about an asset in an organization, we talk about a physical device, right? So a user endpoint, a server in the closet, that type of things. And then, we transition into virtual devices. So something with an IP address, a virtual instance, a EC2 instance, or something, a compute workload somewhere, right? And then that goes into serverless functions and storage buckets and so on and so forth, right? But to me, more than that is it's not just all these software defined elements in your infrastructure that makes up assets. So think about this in terms of an organization's digital operations, right? So in digital operation would include things like, for example, development aspects, right? So developers, they work in code, right? So they have code repos, and the code repos are stored and managed in GitHub or Bitbucket or somewhere, right? So the configurations and metadata about the code repositories, about the pull requests, right? Those changes to code, and developers who are making those changes, all of those are part of your asset because they are an element of the digital operation. Right, even things like if you have a user in Slack, a Slack channel, and interactions there, that could be your asset. A security awareness training module, that could be an asset, right? So all of those things. An IAM policy, right? An IAM role, that could be an asset, right? So all of those things. But there's something more though, right? So there's something more is then, if you have a collection of those assets, that's great, and you see how they're configured and so on, that's great. But there's something above and beyond that, right? So because a collection of the assets would will help you understand the what questions, right? So what do you have, maybe who owns them, and those type of questions. But that does not help you answer the so what question, right? So I'll give you an example. If you say, hey, I have an AWS instance, or maybe a server somewhere. It doesn't have to be an EC2 instance, or some resource or some device, and there was an attack going on, and or potential attack, right? So an alert that happened, and say, hey, maybe it's from guard duty, maybe it's from inspector, maybe it's from somewhere else. It says, hey, this guy is under attack, or is having some problem, and this is 2 a.m. in the morning. And the security analyst or the instant responder got this alert and pager duty and wake them up, right? And then he goes, oh my God, now I got to deal with this. Should I call someone? Should I wake somebody else up? And should I take this thing offline? And what do I do with it, right? So
emergencies only happen in the nighttime, don't they?
It only happens on nights and weekends, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Right. So what do I do with it? So now that goes to the next part, is the so what question, right? You have something, the what, but so what? Is this a real problem? Do I need to deal with it right now? Can it wait until the morning? Can it wait until Monday? Right. So the so what question has to be answered by relationships, by connecting the dots between these assets and resources. Right. So using that example, if I now know that this instance that was alerted by guard duty or something else, if I can make the connection and say, well, this instance does or does not have access to a data store that stores critical data, or this instance is behind a load balancer, so if I take this offline, or autoscale group, that it will not cause a production outage. And does this instance is or is it not in a blast radius that connects to other critical assets and resources, right? All of those questions that can be answered with moments notice has to be answered by understanding their relationships and how those dots are connected across the entire environment. Right. So
I also just want to ask a quick question there, just about even the intentions behind something going wrong. Sometimes people don't have bad intentions internally, and they could accidentally tamper with an EC2 instance that's in the production account. I think we have this notion of security as some bad actor coming in to do damage on purpose, but often it can just be kind of an internal mistake that just happens by accident.
That's
and I'm
exactly
curious
right.
what you have to say about that.
Yeah, and how do you know that, right? How do you know if this is a result of an actual attack or somebody made a mistake, right? And I think a lot of that also goes back to correlation, right? So using that example, right? So a lot of the changes are managed by cloud, right? I mean by code, right? So either that's Terraform or CloudFormation or something like that, right? So imagine that if we can instrument the pipeline and connect the dots down to that level of who made the change and where did the change come from. So you can actually see that, hey, if this is a malicious change made by a bad actor, or if this is a developer who made a mistake, right? By going down to the source and say, well, this change came from this pull request, and this pull request came from this developer and from this code, and whether or not this pull request was actually approved and reviewed by a team member. And if that was the case, it's likely a mistake, right? It's just somebody made a mistake and it wasn't truly malicious. Or on the other hand, you could even make connections and say, well, this change was made from a code, but this code was not approved, and this was made by a developer, and correlating that to the developer's endpoint machine and the security agent running on the machine, and that agent actually alerted something malicious or suspicious going on that developer's endpoint machine. So if you are able to connect those dots, then you can now kind of understand there could be a potentially malicious actor or bad actor doing this rather than just a developer making a simple mistake, right? So a lot of those, again, relies on connecting the dots and knowing that full picture of that entire environment, not just the cloud infrastructure, not just a particular instance or a particular device, but that whole chain.
That makes sense. So a quick question, Erkan, as you mentioned, the kind of the chain of events that needs to happen in order for a developer to commit their code, the approval, and just by seeing that chain of events happen, you can decide whether it was a malicious attack or it was just a developer making a mistake. How do you balance between security, keeping things secure, but also allowing everyone and the developers to have the agility that they require in order to iterate and innovate?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So that's part of I dealt with that a lot in my prior role at Fidelity as the head of software security there, and at the cloud company as the CISO there. So part of what we really wanted to do, I think security organization has very much the intent to be the business enabler, right, and not be the blocker and the people who just keep saying no at every turn of the corner. But how do you do that, right? How do you balance that is a great question. And I think that the only way to really balance that is by sort of shifting the mindset a little bit. And instead of saying, hey, you shall not do A, B, and C, and say and kind of implement it in a different way, and for the developers to say, hey, developers, if you do X, Y, and Z, then you get on this fast lane or like this kind of TSA pre-check equivalent, right, with a fully automated pipeline that you can, make your changes smoothly without the security team being in your way.
Yeah.
Right. So that's how we practice here internally as well at JupiterOne.
That's awesome. I like that. I love sorry, Chloe. I love the choice that you give them, right? It's like there's you can do this two ways. You can do this the easy way, or you can do this where you're kind of kicking against the pricks, right? And so it's not so much saying no, you're really just giving them two options and they get to choose from there. I really like that mindset.
Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah. So
I just want to reintroduce the show and you guys, just because I know that more people have joined. So for those of you who are just joining, this is Howdy Partner, where we bring on our partners from AWS, from the AWS Partner Network, to showcase their products. And today we have JupiterOne talking about security.
Thank you for that. And just to kind of tack back onto that subject real quick, right? So then if you do that, right, so it really solves a couple of things, right? So it makes the developer experience a lot better because they know that there is a smoother way to get their things done, because everybody really is just trying to do the right thing and trying to move the business forward, right? And security is also trying to do the right thing and trying to reduce risk and identify threats. So it accomplishes the developer experience challenge, but at the same time, it also accomplishes the fundamental configuration hygiene challenge, right? So if you say, hey, give a very simple example. We want all of our data stores to have classification and tagging of, ownership or something with that, right? So in S3 bucket and whatever case may be. Now, it's actually pretty simple if you use Terraform or CloudFormation, right? So this is just, you describe your infrastructure, you add those things as part of your code, and you go off with it, right? So now what we do, right? So this is something that we can analyze in JupiterOne and plot different trends and reports and alerts, and using queries to help identify if there's anything that does or does not have those type of configuration as part of your security hygiene or your configuration hygiene, right? So if you do, then there's no stopping the deploy, everything goes forward. If you don't, that may be over a period of time, then you get sort of these speed bumps, right? So hey, you get slowed down, and somebody has to review and approve an exception, and so it gets both of those accomplished pretty easily.
Awesome.
I feel like Erkan you're touching on something that I kind of was hoping you'll dig into more. You mentioned like bridging the gap between security and compliance, and I feel like we're almost there. I'd like to hear your thoughts on like compliance as code and kind of how you really see that bridge like completing in your mind.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, how do we look at compliance, right? So let me maybe walk you through a day in life of an auditor, right? So I've been there, and maybe it's PCI or HIPAA or something. So I'll show up. So pretend I'm the auditor right now. So, and Akash, you're the customer. So I'll show up, right, and say, hey, Akash, I'm here to do your PCI or HIPAA or SOC 2 audit. Now here, I'm gonna send you my information request list, right? So this is a spreadsheet, 120 items. You go collect that information, and we're gonna have a 2-day sessions to go through them, right? So what does Akash do? So Akash would say, okay. Well, that's a bunch of data. So some of those I have, a lot of those I don't. Let me stop the developers from what they're doing. Let me stop the DevOps team from what they're doing, or the HR teams or whatever, right? And you guys go collect that information for me. And they looked at Akash and they're like, I'm not doing that, right? So there's then a lot of these back and forth, right? So nothing gets done, until 4 weeks later. And 4 weeks later, you got all of that information. And the two of us, we sit down and we review those. You collected all the documentation and you collected all the evidence and reports and so on, right? And I say, well, does this include a 10% sampling of your data? You say, yes, it does. And I said, great. They all look great, and I checked the box, right? So that basically is how this process works. Right.
So you missed one step, Erkan, actually, which is you get all this stuff together, you use up all these resources, you submit it, and then they're like, actually, you're missing this thing, and you have to go back and do it all over again.
yes, back and forth. There's a lot of that too, right? So at the end of the day, right? So if you finally got through to the end of the tunnel and get to the final, check the box, I'll sign off on that piece of paper and say, Akash, you're good to go for another year. All right. So and then Akash, you forget about it until the next time. So what's wrong with this whole picture, that whole story? So there are two things that are primarily broken in sort of this compliance approach, right? So I'm sure you guys are already seeing it. One is this is a point in time exercise, right? It's a point in time exercise with point in time data collection. It takes a lot of work, right? So not to mention that it's just you have to kind of break up and interrupt everybody do this data collection. It's a lot of work with not a whole lot of meaning because it's point in time. That's not even the biggest problem. It's not only point in time, it's also just a sample set. So, in security, we all know that, it only takes the weakest link, right? It only takes that one thing to go wrong for it to hit a fan, right? So that's it. So what we just did there is Akash gave me a sample set of maybe it's 10%, and that 10% looks super clean. So what guarantees, what assurance do I have, or do you have, Akash, to ensure that the rest of the 90% looked exactly just like that? And there's not that one thing that breaks. How do you know that? Well, I don't know. I'm just doing my job as an auditor, right? You can't guarantee that. So nobody knows that.
Yeah.
So those are the two things. One is that point in time exercise, and second is that sampling exercise that makes compliance so broken and not very meaningful today. Right. So now the question, I'm sure I had this discussion with you and others on the solutions team, right, so Akash? And then you would ask, well, it sounds great, but this already takes a lot of work, right? It takes a lot of work to get a point in time sample data set collected for just this one audit. Now you're saying I need to report on 100% of the population of all the data and configuration all the time. How is that possibly? I'm not going to do. I'm not signing up for that, right? So. And then how can we do that, right? We all know a continuous full population analysis is the right way to go, but how do we do that? The only way we do that is with automation, and with that's what JupiterOne actually provides, right? So it's this data collection on an automated API-driven basis from all of the data points, not just infrastructure, right? Because when we talk about compliance, it's a compliance for the entire organization, for the entire program. We're not talking about SOC 2 for AWS infrastructure, right? We're talking about SOC 2 for JupiterOne or SOC 2 for your company, right? We're talking about HIPAA for your organization or PCI. It's not just for that subset of an infrastructure. It has to encompass your development processes, your endpoints, your users, your HR, all of those things, right? So that's why with JupiterOne, we actually build this asset knowledge base, or this, CMDB. And going back to what I redefine assets, or all of those things, these software-defined entities and relationships in your digital operations, and use that, automatically automate the data collection of all of those, and use kind of queries and mappings to provide compliance evidence on a continuous and full population analysis basis. That's how you do it.
Awesome. And today we're going to get an insider look of what that looks like. Is that right?
Absolutely. So let me kind of share with you a couple of resources, and then I'll ask Akash to give you an insider look and a demo of the platform.
Sounds good.
So
you're good. We can see it.
Okay, so here's a couple of kind of high-level resources, right? So this is JupiterOne, and you can see the homepage here, and on the website there's a lot of resources, screenshots, and so on. We also do have a free level, right? A free product, and this is SaaS, right? This is you can just sign up, and you don't have to install anything. You don't even have to download anything. There's no agent. You just go off and go. And this goes off to what I was talking about at the very beginning, that we believe security is a basic right for every organization. So even if you are the smallest startup of the world, and a lot of the thing that we believe in is that for all of us to do well as a community, everybody needs to do well, right? So to be secure. So we want to provide this at no charge for those who are just getting started, maybe without a security budget, maybe without a security team, and you can still get started doing security the right way. So here's a couple other resources, and here's the support site, and here is a library of all of the questions, right? You go to ask.jupiterone.com. This is a library of all of the questions that we have prepackaged that you have access to in the application itself. And it showcases some of the use cases, right? So some of the things that you can ask about JupiterOne and get answers from. So it's across multiple operation domains of a security program. And we also have a lot of resources open source on GitHub, right? That you can leverage, right? Lots of repos there, and then I'll show you the architecture real quick.
Erkong, I got to say that's awesome that you really do have this mindset of community, and that you're allowing, the startups, the little guys, to still have access to this kind of thing, all this kind of stuff. Because, oftentimes you want to start a business, you want to make sure things are secure and that your ducks are in a row. But at the same time, these solutions can be sometimes pretty spendy. I mean, $500 is a lot to a startup sometimes, right? And so the fact that you have this free tier is actually really noble of JupiterOne.
Well, thank you. Yeah, so we certainly wanted to make our contribution to the community and help folks, right? Because we've been there, right? So we are still a startup, right? So we want to make sure that people have access to the right resources.
Awesome.
So here, so back to the architecture here a little bit. So you can see that is a data aggregation, right? So this is a sort of that CMDB with our redefined definition of assets, right? So digital resources, digital entities, and relationships that are aggregated from your digital operations environment, including the infrastructure like AWS and development environments and infrastructure, user and identity infrastructure, and endpoints and agents and vulnerability scanners, right? So all of those things can be correlated, and then you can build a robust and automated workflow on top of the data, right? So the workflow can then, be fulfilling different use cases. They can be fulfilling, automating the vulnerability remediation, prioritization, and workflow. It can automate the compliance data collection and evidence collection workflow. You can automate and visualize reporting and trends and key metrics at a program level. And you can use the graph analysis to do threat analysis, threat modeling, instant response, and so on and so forth, right? So all of that becomes possible on a single platform.
And that's what we love, single platform. I don't like having to jump around from tool to tool, just having it all in one place.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, so I'll let Akash, show a deeper demo of the product itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start sharing my screen, if that makes sense, Braeden.
Yeah, go ahead and let me pull it up here. And while he's doing that, a quick reintroduction, everyone, for those who have just joined us. This is Howdy Partner, where we bring on AWS Partner Network partners to showcase our partners and their products. So today we have JupiterOne, and we're joined by Erkong and Akash. So right now, Akash is going to be taking us through a little bit of a demo of their product. So Akash, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. And, obviously feel free to chime in with questions, you guys. And, Erkong, obviously feel free to chime in as well. Your insight on top of what I'm showing will obviously be valuable. And I'm going to open up with actually something related to Erkong. And I just want to show like the graph that he was talking about, right? All of the ingestion that we do across integrations, and kind of just show you really visually what JupiterOne is all about. So this is a query, a pre-built query that we have. What is the blast radius for a compromised user endpoint? And if we input a MAC address here, we can actually, this is actually Erkong's MacBook. So he didn't know I was going to do this, but I thought it'd be fun. So we're going to just take a look at everything that Erkong's user, right, can do. And this is kind of the idea of JupiterOne in a nutshell, is that we have Erkong's MacBook here. We have all these properties that we've ingested from an MDM that we integrate with. And from that, we can see who owns it, right? And the idea is, like Erkong mentioned, what are these entities? What is everything that's software defined, including users? And how are they related to one another? So Erkong owns this MacBook, great. If this MacBook were compromised, what would be the, what would be the result of that? Or, and put in other terms, how far could someone get if they had access to Erkong's MacBook? So we can see that there's a Okta user, right? There are 5 Okta applications here associated with it. There's this AWS IAM role that's been assigned to this Okta user as well. You can already see that we're doing like one step beyond just ingesting a ton of data into a CMDB. We're actually seeing how that data maps together across integration. So how can someone have federated access into AWS from Okta, for example? And this graph is fully dynamic, right? So we are obviously looking at everything else Erkong has access to Bitbucket. Looks like he has another set of Okta users over here, or another Okta user over here with another set of applications, 50 plus applications over here that someone could access, a security role, another developer role. And this graph, everything in JupiterOne is mapped together in this way. So if we wanted to expand further and see who else has been assigned this developer role, we could obviously check and look into that. And there's these other 8 Okta users, it looks like. We can see who they are. We can see what specific IAM policy has been assigned to this IAM role. And we could see what's the Okta user group that it's been assigned to as well. And again, this is just in a quick nutshell how everything is mapped together in JupiterOne. So when it comes down to it, understanding how someone can have access into my production AWS accounts via a federated role is really, really important, right? And those cross integration linkages are just not visible almost at all in any other way. So again, that's kind of like what we're trying to accomplish here, if that makes sense.
So Akash, I had a quick question here. So
Yeah, absolutely.
this graph that you're showing us, and actually let me pull it back up because I switched us. This is obviously at a machine level or like a VM level, right? So you got the MacBook, which is connected to, and I'm not quite sure if I see. So like, are there roles included? Is that like each circle represents, different things such as an IAM role and then like a policy? Is that kind of what those links are looking at or doing?
So the linkages, the edges that you're talking about are mapping like how these things are related, but each node can be anything software defined, including an IAM role, like you mentioned. So this is actually a IAM role called developer. You can see here that the type is a AWS IAM role in the top right here. And this AWS IAM role has been assigned to these 8 Okta users. And this AWS IAM role has also been assigned this power user access IAM policy. So we're really going well beyond just devices and kind of hosts and your traditional assets to grab anything software defined, including IAM policies. And within an IAM policy, we can actually, see the raw data of that policy as well, and view, the effects that have been allowed, or the effects and the actions that have been allowed or denied in that case as well. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, so Akash, I think if you just expand on that power user access, you should be able to see what access it allows, right?
Exactly. So it
Would you
allows
also
an
be
audit.
able to give a brief overview of what IAM is and what the implications are for some people on the stream right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So AWS IAM is essentially identity and access management. The idea is that things are not really segregated by network so much anymore as they're really segregated by access, right? So it's not all about having everything be in different VPCs, different regions. That's obviously part of security, but the other part is really just who has access to what. And IAM is kind of the way to monitor that, assigning the correct roles to people so that they have the least privileges required, the right policies on those roles so that they have access to create the resources they need to, and nothing more than that, right? It's easy to imagine if everyone had administrator access to an AWS account, how disastrous that would be. But that's kind of the one end of the spectrum. But even just having some overprivileged roles, some overprivileged policies can really result in some havoc, especially when those roles are potentially assigned to instances or Lambda functions that could be compromised or somehow not being monitored in a typical way.
Yeah, part of this is, so think about all the things that you have to do in security, right? So, and there's all these different actions. So there's patch management, there is configuration management, there is security awareness training, there is then user access review, right? So not just user access provisioning, but user access review, and all of those things around user access. Now, imagine that you have thousands of employees and you have thousands of AWS accounts and different IAM roles, and they are different. There's different assignments. You tell your team to say, hey, security team, you got to do an access review every month. That's a tremendous amount of work, right? So if you are going at this manually or even by writing some scripts, it's a lot of work to analyze all of those, and they change all the time. Now, instead, what you want to do is for this data to be pre-analyzed and just connect the dots, and you can come in here and just put in somebody's name or write some queries to identify potential risky access and set up alerts for those, right? So then your access review tasks and job becomes a lot easier.
Makes sense.
Absolutely. An access review across all the different services, as Erkan mentioned, is incredibly difficult. Even just within AWS is incredibly difficult at times. So makes a lot of sense as well. And I think this ties right back into what you were saying, Erkan. If you expand the graph on the power user access policy, you can see exactly what's been allowed by this policy. And constructing a query to say, find all the users that have roles assigned to them, that have policies assigned to them, and just getting literally in one query all of the access to your AWS account in a table, honestly, is still better than what most people are dealing with today, let alone the precise querying we could do, like find all the people who have access to EC2, find all the people that have access to IAM, find all the people who have access to execute specific actions within a specific service in AWS. So those types of user access reviews, as Erkang mentioned, are suddenly really easy in JupiterOne. So.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. And Akasha, I'm not sure what your flow will be, right? So, but I think it definitely makes sense to highlight the S3 security part and maybe using the dashboards that we have.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great place to go. Let's do that. So
while Akash is actually going there real quick, that to kind of tie up that point that you mentioned, those reviews that come up, that's it's funny that you say that. Chloe and I actually help perform some of those reviews, the foundational technical review for our partners, and in which we have one of our requirements is how can you audit your permissions and your IAM roles on a quarterly basis. And for people or for companies that have hundreds of roles, that's so hard to do. It's easy to say, yeah, sure, we do that, but to be able to honestly be able to say, yes, we do that on a quarterly basis, I mean, I think it's invaluable to be able to actually see that in one place, and like you said, not have to build a complex query.
That's right.
Exactly. So you guys are going to start using JupiterOne, right? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah.
That's just good. So we're going into the insights dashboards here. And again, JupiterOne is really built as a platform. So we have all of your data ingested automatically. You can push data into the graph database as well. Everything is queryable in a precise way, and we've written a query language that's high level. It's easier than any other graph query language to learn. It's easier than SQL by a long shot as well. And the idea is that you can then visualize any query that you can think of as well. So if you need to construct metrics, reports on certain things, in this case, a simple query, just find anything that was created in the last 48 hours and just visualize it however you want. And something that Erkang mentioned was, what about our S3 bucket dashboard? We have a bunch of pre-built dashboards. You don't have to build your own dashboards, obviously. And S3 security, I think, always relevant. Everyone cares about it. And it's definitely worth taking a look at right now. I'm not sure if you want to speak to it, Erkang, while I'm here. I know you probably have some.
I can speak to this a little bit. You can just kind of keep the screen here, right?
Yeah,
so
sure.
So S3, we all know that there are, multiple ways for it to be configured incorrectly, right? So I know AWS over the years has taken some measures to help people understand how to configure it correctly and alert people when it's not configured correctly and so on and so forth. But there are still many ways that it can go wrong. And especially, taking into an organization's specific context, right, into what is and is not supposed to be public within a S3 bucket, right? Because just by saying that, S3 buckets is public is a problem isn't necessarily the best approach, right? Because you have to take into account all of those context. And the other thing that we need to understand is that there are many different ways an S3 bucket can be configured to be public or exposed or somehow, right? And some of those is through ACLs. It could be through a bucket policy, but it could be through a cross-account trust, or it could also be through one of these scenarios below here, right? So if you scroll down a little bit, this right here that says non-public S3 bucket exposed via public-facing EC2 instances, right? So this is a highly connected relationship here where you have a bucket that is internal, right? So the bucket itself is not configured to be public-facing, and it should be fine, right? It looks fine, but what ended up happening is you have an EC2 instance here on the other side. The EC2 instance is publicly facing, and maybe that EC2 instance could have a finding, right? So this is where something like inspector and guard duty could come into play, right? So we could identify if this EC2 instance that's publicly facing has potential vulnerabilities or whether or not it's under attack. And then at the same time, this instance could be assigned an IAM profile with an IAM role and an IAM policy that allows access to this internal bucket, right? So what this effectively is doing is then saying that, hey, anything that goes wrong in this instance would allow potential attacker or public access of this bucket that is not meant to be public, right? So that's just one example of how we build this a graph data model and using graph to connect the dots of these configurations so you can answer these so what questions, right? So, you know, this is an example, right? So we can say, hey, if I have an alert on this instance, this is one that you really need to take a look, right? So you should wake somebody up at 2 a.m. in the morning, because guess what? It is connected to an internal bucket, right? If this guy is breached, then your internal bucket is probably breached.
So let's talk about that a little bit. Does JupiterOne have like any sort of alerting that, you know, if it for some reason is public but shouldn't be public, is there some kind of, do they get a text or an email?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to dig into kind of Erkong's example here, because this was obviously, I mean, some of us might remember a really famous data breach. This was the vector of attack here. You know, not going to call anyone out on stream, but you can absolutely configure an alert on any query. So I'll touch to your question first, Braeden. We have a whole alert section of the app where you can use our pre-built rule packs too. And the idea is that, yeah, you want to monitor something, you want to have your security policy as code in the form of a query, which is actually a lot easier than traditional policies as code, which is actually like some kind of strange YAML or JSON file that is not super intuitive because it doesn't look like code. But you know, that's what policy as code is for a lot of people. Having it as just a simple query is even easier. And then defining those, sending emails, Slack messages, Jira tickets, ServiceNow incidents are all kind of the manual workflows you can trigger. And we even support like a shift left methodology. Once you alert the asset owner specifically and create one-off ticket for that person to go handle this, or DM them in Slack specifically, even if you wanted to, for a more chat ops approach. But the alternative is more automation as well. Like if you want to publish an SNS message to an AWS topic, if you want to send an SQS message and trigger a Lambda function, you could easily do that, or even webhook into a third-party service to trigger something automatic, right? So a common use case for S3 would be, I'm going to send an SQS message, trigger a Lambda function, and just enable default encryption on any S3 bucket that JupiterOne finds to be unencrypted, right? And that's just, you know, that's bread and butter stuff, and it can make a ton of sense for almost any use case as well. One of those workflows will make sense, right? And in the case of what Erkong was discussing here, I just wanted to pull it up again and really dig into it, because it's a great example of how, there are vectors of attack that we just can't see from traditional kind of bucket configuration type of analysis. Like if you just checked the bucket policy, the ACL, and the public configuration of this bucket, you would have no idea that this is vulnerable, because it's happened through access from an instance that was exposed to the internet. And this is all valid, configuration from a configuration perspective. It's that combination of configurations, the relationships between them, that makes it a misconfiguration. And that's really not visible in in most setups, right? When you're not taking this approach. So.
Great.
Did that? Yeah, totally. And so I was just gonna say, I guess, did that answer your question on the alert side? And yeah, anything else you would add to that, Erkong, as far as kind of this particular example? I can also jump back to the S3 insights board if there's something else here that we should be talking about, because there's a lot here to ingest, right? But
yeah, I think that's a good example of highlighting why the relationships matter, right? Exactly. And there's a lot of other examples here, and you can see this dashboard has a bunch of things that give you metrics and data on different things, right? Like this right here. So here's another good example, right? So this one has two things going on. One, it says, hey, there are three S3 buckets that contain CloudTrail logs. And then the next one that says there are two buckets that have unencrypted CloudTrail logs, right? So a bucket with data that's unencrypted by itself, may not be a significant issue, right? But combined with you're storing your security logs in a bucket and that's not encrypted, may be an issue, right? So these are the type of context that you can apply to the configuration to make it more meaningful.
Absolutely.
Why is that an issue? Just curious to hear your thoughts there.
Well, because, so typically security logs are considered critical or sensitive data, right? And that needs to be, non-repeatable. You cannot edit and change the log, and that needs to be fully protected. So it cannot be easily, seen by others as, what activities is going on, right? So that's why encryption and integrity protection is important for logs.
Perfect. So I'm going to kind of jump back over to the landing page real quick and show some other interesting queries, right? We kind of already saw that we can monitor federated access into AWS, but we were talking about actually user access for a second. And then we also talked about GuardDuty Inspector at the top of the stream. So I want to kind of go over there and show you some of the stuff we can do with those as well. I just want to quickly show a query, related to user access and just show exactly what you were discussing, seeing all of the users, including Okta users, including IAM users that have been assigned any access role, that have assigned any access policy. This is, again, just like a single query. And if you were to return this in table form, let's say, instead of the list form, you could return all of the properties you needed. Or in the graph form, we can actually specifically see who are these 8 users, what have they been assigned, who are these 2 Okta users that have the administrator role. And again, just wanted to show again that those types of IAM analysis are really easy. So if that's a use case for anyone out there, we'll handle it natively. So I'm gonna jump over to like alerts and start digging into some GuardDuty, digging some inspector findings. How do we pull that data in? What can we do with that information? And these are both great tools, right? Because, sorry, clicked on the wrong thing. These are both great tools because, as you mentioned, traditional SIEM can be incredibly expensive. GuardDuty gets so much done in AWS, it's ridiculous. We always recommend taking the point solution from the cloud provider like AWS GuardDuty or AWS Inspector for that matter, over a third-party service because it's more native, it's cheaper, and it's more effective most of the time as well because it's native. So with respect to that, like what can we do with something that was found in GuardDuty? And we have this one GuardDuty finding that I'm going to look into right here. So this is a low finding. Let's pretend it was a high finding. Why not? Let's say you actually came in, you were going to take a look at this GuardDuty finding because you were concerned about these brute force attacks against some instance. You'll see that right away, we have all of the information that GuardDuty would have provided you with, which is all very valuable. When was the last seen? What's the instance ID, the numeric severity, description of the attack, etc. And we also have this kind of graph-based view, right? So you can see here's the instance right away that has this finding. You have all of the configuration information on that instance right away. As we've shown before, the actual graph is dynamic, so you could dig into the instance, identify its AMIs, its other inspector findings on it, its ENI that it's using, any security group that it's connected to, the EBS volume, SSH key, etc., a subnet that it's on. And you can really just, from an IR perspective, have a field day when you're trying to dig in and identify context around some alert or finding that you've been given, right? So some event happened, you're digging into it, and you have all the context in the world right at your fingertips. You don't have to go digging dramatically in a bunch of different sources to identify what's going on, and it's all really obvious in the graph as well. And we also provide some other views. So like there's an owners and maintainers view. So you can kind of see who had access to this instance, who might be responsible to go and take care of this problem. who should you be reaching out to? So in this case, maybe Lincoln Roach with his inline IAM policy here, Amazon EC2 full access, is probably the guy that we want to go chase down about this particular thing. It looks like everyone else is just a role provision to an external trust with a security audit policy or something like that. It seems pretty, reasonable. Let's put it that way. The network path, again, another view. How is this connected to the internet? And again, all this context just really helps when you're trying to deal with an event, right? From an IR perspective, from a findings perspective, vulnerability perspective. So we provide this for inspector findings, guard duty findings. I'll dig into an inspector finding in a second. But everything is really just a query, right? This is actually just an embedded query in our UI. We're built 100% API driven. So if you want to do this via API, if you want to ask a more specific question, you can, right? This is literally just an embedded query in our UI. So alerts, everything is possible. We have a ton of people that kind of use JupiterOne for really the platform scripting, extensibility, and then a whole bunch of folks that love the UI as well. So just worth mentioning.
I definitely love the UI. I like the fact that like you said, like the context that you can get from all this, that everything from how is this connected to the internet to who has access to that and what does that look like. I mean, it kind of goes back to what Erkan was saying at the beginning. It's like you get the page in the middle of the night, you wonder, what do you do? Wait, A, what do you do about it? And two, when you do figure out, who do you wake up next, right? And this definitely narrows it down for you.
Right, exactly. I like that. Who do you wake up next? How do you hand it off, right? That's a great, that's the reality. That's what everyone's asking. So that's what we help you with.
We actually have a quick question in the chat. It's from AT Witchell 22. Any pre-built alerts and rules? I think you touched a little bit on that. Yeah. So you might have just missed that, AT Witchell.
Yeah, I'm happy to touch on that again. It's a great question. I didn't really dig into it, so definitely happy to touch on that. One thing I'll mention is we also include the web link as a property on all of these nodes. So if at any point you're like, all right, I know what I need to do, I need to go delete this or reconfigure this, you have the web link right here. You'll be taken right to the console. You can do what you need to do as well. So just worth mentioning. So within our alerts, we have kind of these rule packs, and just straight to your question, AT, we have a bunch of different rule packs. One of them is AWS config. We have AWS threat. We have some other common alerts, DevOps. And the idea is that you want to be monitoring these things. You want to be making sure that you can generate alerts from these when these misconfigurations come about, and really just having these in place, this is probably why you asked the question, is incredibly valuable to just have it automated behind the scenes. Someone's going to get notified when something's wrong, when there's S3 buckets that are at public read, public write, when there's certificates about to expire, when your RDS instances are unencrypted, whatever it might be. We definitely support that. And you can build your own alerts. The pre-built rule pack's very useful, a ton around AWS as well. So yeah.
Yeah, and there's also, I'll chime in here. Right? So in addition to these pre-built alert rules, there are also a lot of the pre-built questions, right? So that was one of the things I was showing, and you can see that in the app as well. So you can run any of these questions from the library directly, and then just click a button to turn that into an alert, right? So the pre-built stuff, it's not limited to just the alert rules. So this is another set of pre-built resources here that you can leverage.
Exactly.
So here's an example that Akash running through, right? So
this is incredible. I didn't realize. I just made the connection. This is what you meant by like question library. Like you can type in just normal plain English and it'll answer you with the graph. It just finally clicked. I'm like, oh yeah, like that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah. And when you run any of these, then you can turn any of these into an alert.
Exactly. So who's been assigned full administrator access, for example? I just clicked on one from the query library, and yeah, you can configure an alert on this, as Erkan just mentioned, just like anything else. So you don't have to be writing from scratch. That's a great point. You can leverage any of our, like, I think 375 plus pre-built questions, and you can type in natural language, get those all in. Yeah, great,
Yeah.
great point.
Yeah, and one thing I'll mention here as well, right, is that, you know, the reason we don't prepackage hundreds and hundreds of alert rules is we believe that less is more in many cases, because, you know, we don't want to start off by generating a ton of noise, right? So it's often better if you start using these questions and ask questions, look at the response and the answers a little bit, and then configure the right alert rules from here. And what this allows you to do is it allows you an opportunity to tune it very easily as you create the alert, right? Like right here, if you say, well, you know, these four are okay, so these are the, you know, exceptions, you can very easily add some attributes and say, hey, you know, if the user is this or whatever, and if whatever context applies, or tagging, or so on and so forth, you can leverage that to easily tune that so that your alert becomes very accurate and less noisy from the very beginning.
I like that.
Exactly.
I was actually going to ask what, you know, obviously these prepackaged rules are very helpful, but like what the philosophy was behind alerts, right? Because we've all heard of like alert fatigue. At some point,
That's
you
right.
sometimes get so many alerts that you're like, you're just going to start ignoring it. You're not going to take it as seriously. So
Yeah.
the approach that you just mentioned is actually really, I think, very natural, right? It's just like allow it to kind of like, you know, be a little bit too much and then scope it down to, because then you'll learn what's actually important. And then from that point on, you know that what you get is actually going to be important.
That's right. That's right. And what we do also cover is some of the other baselines, right? More from a best practices and or compliance standpoint, right? So what Akash hasn't showed is the compliance dashboard portion of our app. So things around, you know, CIS benchmarks for the different cloud infrastructures, and you know, things around even regulatory compliance, like, you know, HIPAA and PCI, or, you know, SOC 2 with your own controls, and so on and so forth, right? So all of those can be managed, and with data and query map to these requirements to generate evidence on a continuous basis, right? Which ties into what I was saying earlier. You know, how do we have a continuous compliance approach, right? So this right here becomes basically your status page for compliance, right? You no longer just have a piece of paper signed by an auditor once a year. You have data-driven evidence that's updated on a continuous basis.
This is absolutely incredible. Like I don't know. Like I feel like this is the thing that we've all been, you know, thinking about, like, but we just couldn't visualize in our own mind. You know, like, this might date me a little bit, but if you remember being in school and there's like the projector, right, and then you can layer on these like transparent pages over each other, right? And so sometimes I can think that's what we should be doing with compliance like standards, right? So sometimes like the HIPAA requirements overlaps a little bit with ISO, you know, whatever, or, you know, SOC 2, right?
That's
But,
right.
you know, each time you have to do a separate review for, like, have to get these requirements again. So it'd be nice to be able to just stack it on top of each other, kind of like those projectors, those transparent projectors. And this is essentially what that does right here, is kind of stacks all those requirements together. And to your point, even better, it's live, right? So tomorrow, if it did change, you can quickly remediate that or address it.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah, I also want to
Exactly.
add that the interactions between resources is so key here, and understanding how the interaction between resources could potentially make something not compliant. And I think that's definitely an issue that we've seen come up for customers, you know, because they may have individual resources that are compliant, but the way that those resources engage with each other or have certain policies or rules attached to them is not compliant. So, you know, it takes less burden off the customer when you have something like this to help you, which is awesome.
Yep.
Absolutely.
That's great to hear.
So yeah, so I mean, I think that you guys got the vision really clearly there, and that was a great explanation, Erkong. I'm wondering, would it make sense to kind of you know, dig into like one of these examples and kind of talk about, you know, how someone might go through and fix something like this? What do you guys feel?
Yeah, I think it makes sense to go through one example and see, how does it detect the gaps?
Yeah, okay, absolutely, right. So let's take a look at this, right? So credentials that are unused for 90 days or greater, this is CIS 1.3 for AWS. And there are a few things here, right, that are clearly they're wrong with this account. And let's pick some of the ones that we would definitely have a problem with. I think having an IAM role that's not been used in 90 days, big issue. Having a user whose password's older than 90 days, also a problem. And let's just start with this first one right here that we were just on. And the idea is, we're running a very simple query in the background, and this has been mapped automatically. If you get a JupiterOne account, again, free, and just import the CIS AWS benchmark, this will automatically be running once you complete your AWS integration, which literally takes like, less than 5 minutes. And the idea is that we're just running this simple query, find AWS IAM role with last used on, is less than the past 90 days. So it hasn't been used for 90 days, and you just get this nice list just right away. This is what you need to attack. This is exactly what needs to be fixed. And you can click on this, you can get the extra information. You can generate an alert using the same endpoint, that same alert endpoint. So you could be constantly notified whenever this happens if you wanted to for your kind of most critical CIS alerts. And you can even do kind of one-off things as well, right? The workflows, like creating a Jira ticket. If you just want to create a one-time ticket, that's also possible, right? You can configure your Jira collector. You can have your specific fields that you want in your tickets and just push out to a Jira board as well and get someone to fix this. And ultimately, the types of kind of workflows that we allow, right? Automated, manual, Jira, ServiceNow, Slack, or something more automated. I think it makes compliance, the workflow, just way more natural, way more engineering focused, a lot more systematic. It's what I get excited about, when I work here, is like, oh, thank goodness, I'm never going to have to do any ridiculous work. Like, you know what I mean? Because we use this internally, right? So anytime I'm on the security side, anytime we need to clean something up, it's like, just feels so natural that being notified in Slack in an alert to have a ticket just created for you. I don't have to go check on stuff. No one's like pinging me with an email like, have you checked on this quarter or this month or whatever? It's just all happening behind the scenes. This is, again, happening daily. I definitely have a lot of kind of passion around that. So just want to touch on that.
Absolutely. I think that in kind of what you were saying, right? It's like, you never know when someone's going to drop in and just say, hey, real quick, like what's touching this instance, right? We've all been there where, supervisor comes in and understandably they got some requirements that just got dropped on their plate. So they're coming to you to say, okay, can you run this report real quick? And be like, yeah, let me run this really perfectly easy query on this perfect database that has all the information you need, right? So this essentially does that for you.
Exactly. Everything's there. And it is easy to run those reports all of a sudden. And honestly, if you never have to run it again after you run it once, right? You can just set up an alert, it's being monitored, or set up a dashboard, it's being monitored, whatever makes sense. And you're just happy knowing that next time that's asked, you have the exact answer. You could even be alerted if something goes wrong. So again, I think alert fatigue is something we could dig into some more, because constructing some of these queries to be tuned, I think, is really important, and is something I could also quickly talk about, let's say in the context of like one of these alerts, if that makes sense.
Sure, absolutely.
Cool. So I'm just going to filter, let's see, something that we've been talking about, like maybe S3 related. So let's say, yeah, okay, so there's some buckets, let's say here, like this S3 buckets, let's just look at this query. And this is going to be a great example of how we're like leveraging tags to filter out noise, right? So this particular rule will actually auto remediate specific buckets that have default encryption disabled, right? And the idea is that we'll trigger an SQS message, and then that will then trigger a Lambda function to then auto remediate these. And so this query is finding an S3 bucket with default encryption enabled equals false, and that has this tag, remediation enabled equals true. So this is something you could provision in Terraform. If this is an S3 bucket that, should just always be encrypted, you add this extra tag. If you don't add this tag, maybe you're just encrypting all your S3 buckets by default, not a problem. But just in case there are some that shouldn't be encrypted, they're publicly accessible, you just add something like this, or use a classification tag like tag.classification is not equal to public is another option. And again, just being flexible to your tags. We're ingesting all of your tags automatically. So if we wanted to do it like this, that would be perfectly reasonable as well. And I missed a quote and I typed a semicolon. But yeah, but this would be perfectly reasonable as well. And essentially, there's this idea that, if I create alerts, I'm just always going to be flooded with a bunch of spam, right? I'm never going to be able to get through them. We basically want to have all the context so that that's never the case, right? And some of our biggest customers have this use case exactly, where they have literally millions, tens of millions of open findings that are high findings on their environments, right? And how are they ever going to get through it? And the idea is that they will create rules, J1QL rules, that are related to their findings. They'll only be notified when it's like a production resource, or there's some specific tags on the resources that makes it extra critical. They'll be only notified when there's correlation between guard duty and inspector, for example, and they're both pointing to the same instance. These types of like useful correlations and properties you can use to really drive down the noise and get like very salient alerts, I think is something that's really exciting too.
So real quick, you mentioned about the correlation. Is that being done on behalf of the user on the back end?
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
Okay.
So
there's nothing you have to do upfront in order to configure that.
Yeah, no, there's nothing you have to do, right? Because the graph discovery is happening automatically. So for example, in AWS, we'll automatically be ingesting guard duty findings, inspector findings. And if those happen to point to the same instance, then this query will automatically trigger, right? Essentially find vulnerable EC2 instances, so medium or higher inspector finding, that are also targets of suspicious activities, basically a medium or higher guard duty finding. And if those are both pointing to the same instance, then we're going to mark it as a high instead of just being medium. And then we're going to get an alert. We're going to send it to Slack. We're going to create a ticket. And suddenly this makes a lot more sense than just looking at every medium guard duty finding or every medium inspector finding on all our accounts, especially in like dev accounts or something like that, where maybe we just don't have time, and we know that there's stuff wrong in there, but if they're correlated, hey, maybe we need to take a look for real at a higher priority. So.
There you go. That's awesome. I like how you can customize essentially the severity. Not that severity should be ignored, but
right.
but it is nice to be able to create your own definition of what critical means in a way that makes more sense to you, right?
Yeah, and I think you hit on it right there. It's not like there's anything wrong with the default severities that are out there. It's just that every business has its own definition of what's truly severe, right? And it's just natural. It's just going to be the case. What matters for you just can't be the same as what matters to someone else as far as what's critical and what's not. So absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah. I think another cool thing to talk about would be kind of configuration hygiene. I bet there's folks thinking like, well, this would be beautiful if I had all my tagging done right, but I really don't have my tagging done right. You know what I mean? So like,
yes.
what happens if I don't have my tags done right? What am I supposed to do? And we actually support that use case as well. So let's say like we're supposed to tag all our data stores with some sensitivity tag or something like that, or some classification tag. Let's actually use that one. So let's say tag.classification is equal to undefined. So we can actually, because of the flexible schema behind the scenes, whatever tags you have, we're ingesting, but we can also search and see if there are tags that have not been put on entities. So this really helps with like, hey, find anything that doesn't have a Terraform tag, anything that was provisioned or created in the last 24 hours that was not created via Terraform because it would have had a Terraform tag or a CloudFormation tag, whatever it might be. The idea is that we can find those really easily. You can alert on those, and you can generate the same like mindset of we're going to drive towards configuration hygiene across the company, because we're going to make sure that we have some kind of ongoing alert around data stores that are unclassified, and we're just going to know at least at an informational level, like how poorly we're doing with our configuration hygiene. And we actually have an alert on this, I think. So let me check real quick. Something like this, unclassified data stores, just seeing that trend over time. And this is not the line you want to see, right? You hope like everyone's working these down, like making sure these are getting, assigned at some kind of classification. But we at least have the excuse that this is a demo environment, so it's static. But this is what it typically is, right? Or something's just going wrong. You can just monitor this at a high level. No one's being alerted. No one's being fatigued. It's just a trend. It's just something we're monitoring in app. And every once in a while, every quarter, every month, we just kind of see how are we doing on some initiative that we want to get better at. We could do this for a specific account. We can do this for a specific tag. And again, we could do this for when we're starting to enable infrastructure as code. Like, are we using CloudFormation correctly? Are we using the tags that we're supposed to be using correctly? And it becomes really easy to monitor all this. And you can even just have a dashboard of just this. How are we doing on our tagging, the configuration hygiene dashboard? And maybe that's the next one Erkan's going to tell me to make in open source. So, but that's the idea. So,
something I just thought of here is that earlier at the beginning of the show, we were talking about security and compliance aren't, you don't do security just for the sake of compliance. They're two separate entities that overlap. But you do them both because they're both important and for each their own sake. And something as I think about security is that security has grown so much in the past 10, 15, 20 years. It used to be as long as your Apache server is not open to the rest of the world, you can't walk the directory, you're good, right? But now all of a sudden there's these new ways to be attacked that it gets to a point where it becomes overwhelming to have to implement all these security things. And it kind of goes back to the fact that these smaller companies or these startups are having a hard time keeping up with all of these compliances, all the possibilities of these different attacks that, having a tool like this to be able to help them understand, oh, you know what, we forgot to tag a handful of these things. Oh, you know what, something's happening or guard duty and inspector are targeting this one EC2 instance, right? So by curbing down that effort, you really do, like you mentioned, enable everybody to have that basic right of security, not just not just cost wise, but also effort wise.
That's exactly right. So I think we are I guess running towards the end of the show here a little bit, right? So
Sure.
that sounds like a good way to kind of wrap up the conversation a bit, right? So getting back to that message of security as the basic right, and security is the wellness of an organization, right? So it's really a couple of things that you mentioned a bit already, right? So that we touch on, right? So one is that security is the wellness in a way that you have to understand the makeup of that ecosystem, right? So for example, how do we know ourselves from a human body and wellness of an individual standpoint, right? So in the past decade or so, there's a lot of effort in things like DNA sequencing, right, and analyzing the biology and understanding the biology of a human body. Now, I see what we're doing here with JupiterOne and building a graph and making things connected, kind of like that, right? So having a graph-based connected CMDB is kind of like doing a constant, DNA sequencing of your organization, so that you understand yourself at a very deep and full extent in order to have a better wellness for your organization, right? So that's one. Around sort of that message around wellness. And number two is you have to take care of the wellness from the beginning, right? So this is not something that you can try to pick up after you've already had a bunch of legacy and technical debt collected, right? It's the same with taking care of your body, right? If you say, hey, I'm just not going to eat well, I'm not going to do my exercise, I'm not going to maintain my personal hygiene, I'm only going to worry about that when I'm 45 years old. Well, guess what?
I feel
Maybe
personally
too late.
attacked. I'm just kidding.
So I think we all of us may all feel a little bit guilty about this, right? So I myself personally need to exercise better, right? So need to exercise more. But I think, but that to some extent, right? So it's like, hey, and more workout or lose weight is the number one New Year resolution for everybody, I guess. But and I think that's the same kind of mindset we should take for organizations and the security of an organization as that, right? You have to kind of start early and do it right, because if you start going down the wrong path and start accumulating a lot of these technical debt from the beginning and implemented a lot of tools, that's really not going to work well for you in the long run, and start having these alert fatigue and noise and all of those start coming in, and then to a point where it will be very difficult to walk back, right? Then becomes such a tremendous project, and at some point you realize, oh, I should have done it correctly. But guess what? You have accumulated so much debt, it may take a year or two to unravel all the things that you had already done to restart the program. Right, so that's the second part on the wellness. The security is the wellness of an organization, and the last part is having access to it. Right, so wellness is kind of like a lot of these are very basic, right? So having access to resources, right, to clean water and food, almost, right, is you have to have that. We cannot have our new generation of the technology companies and startups there to be in cyber poverty, right? So almost to some extent, if you don't have access to the right resources and the right approach of taking care of your wellness, then that is not sort of the community that we should be in, right? So we should help the community, with some kind of a greater good here, right? So that what we're trying to achieve, right? So all of those together is why we're defining, right? So we're saying that security is a basic right, because we look at it as the wellness of an organization.
Thank you, Erkan. I got to tell you, I learned a lot about security today, but I also just feel simply inspired, right? Just the fact that, being able to relate security to, medicine for the body, or, monitoring the body, and, security, poverty, like all of these things are very relatable. I feel like everyone can at least understand that, and being able to see security through those lenses really does help put a different perspective on it.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm very glad to be sharing that, and I'm glad it resonates with you and others.
Yes, absolutely. So, all right, well, this wraps up the end of our show. Everyone, thank you very much for joining us. We were joined today by Erkan and Akash from JupiterOne. Today we went over, JupiterOne's demo of alerting, making sure that you can understand all of the different contexts and seeing the relationships between all of these cloud assets, right? Actually, let me allow you to summarize that, Akash, because I might miss a few. So we mentioned a couple of them. Let's hit the other 3 or 4 things that you hit too.
Yeah, sure. So it all starts with that automated discovery, right? Just visibility into all of your assets across, not just AWS, but all of your security program as well. And then mapping the relationships between them, understanding how everything's connected, how everything is, essentially a potential vector for either attack or, in the best case, defense, right? And then monitoring those configurations and alerting on them, reducing alert fatigue, monitoring configuration hygiene, tying it back to compliance with automated evidence collection, and just really trying to create, a security and compliance program that's really engineering driven, systematic, and as Erkan's mentioned, kind of, available for everyone. So yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. So absolutely right. So give it a try, and JupiterOne is free to start. And the last I'll say is try to answer the so what questions, not just the what. And with JupiterOne, you can know more and fear less.
Yeah,
all right.
Exactly.
So I dropped the links in the chat for everyone. So there's the documentation, the website to JupiterOne, the questions library, and then the GitHub. I'll go ahead and post this in the chat as well. There you go. All right, so Erkang Akash, the way we sign off here, you get to choose from one of 3 sayings that we get to all say together. One of them is happy trails. The other one is y'all come back now. Or the third one is giddy up. So how would you like to end off?
I like y'all come back now personally, but I'll follow Erkong's suit.
No problem. I can go with that or whatever you guys suggest.
All right,
All right,
that's perfect. So count of 3, y'all come back now. 1, 2, 3. Y'all
Y'all
come back.
come back now.
Y'all come back.
All right.
Take care, everyone.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.